Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time. And yes, I got the camera up high again. Some people complain about that, but there's a reason why I do that, so you can get a more downward view of my counter. And today I'm going to be showing you how I make the fermented citrus peel drink. It's basically the same idea as how I make the citrus peel vinegar, but with some slight differences. And I just want to say right off the bat, since I've been making this and taking a little bit of it every day, I feel great. I love what this is doing for me, and I believe all those great flavonoids in there, the lycopene, the quercetin, plus the vitamin C, by doing it this way rather than boiling it down into a decoction, I'm keeping the vitamin C intact as well, and all the other benefits that are found in the citrus peel. Not quinine though, just remember that is an alkaloid that is not in citrus peels at all, but is found in other things. However, quercetin has very similar benefits that quinine does. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I have two videos in regards to that I'll link to down below. The first one is about cinchona bark, grapefruit, and quinine. The second one is about quercetin and its benefits. So I recommend you watch both of those if you're trying to learn more about that and understand where quinine actually comes from. It also does not come from wild quinine. That's an herb, and it's called wild quinine because it works the same way against malaria and flus and colds as real quinine does. Anyway, let's get to this recipe. So what I got the blender out today, and I'm going to show you why in a minute, but you can see here, this is the one I more recently started. It's very bubbly, and I'll show it close up here, shake it a little bit so you can see all the bubbles at the top. When I'm doing it this way, I do like to try to remember to burp it once a day, but I'm just using the plastic lids. You can use the metal lids. I like using the plastic lids with the colors just because it makes it more fun. Or I use the black ones, the ball ones back here. So that's my kimchi that I'm currently working through. That's a red cabbage kimchi. If you're interested in how I make kimchi, somewhat similar to what I'm doing here, I'll link to my video down below, the last one I have on a brine-free kimchi. So anyway, what I have here are some dried. You can use fresh, they do not have to be dried. It's just that as we're working through our citrus fruits, I just let the peels, we put them immediately on the rack that Patrick made, and that's right next to the wood stove, and I just let them dry naturally there. They can take 2 to 3 days depending on the thickness of the peel. Grapefruit usually takes a little bit longer, but since we usually get like satsumas, they have a thinner skin, the orange peels can be dry by the next day. So anyway, that's just a mix in here of grapefruit, lemon, and the satsuma oranges. And just so you know, in this situation, whenever you're talking about consuming the peels in any form, I do highly recommend, if you're able to get it, go with organic if you're able. It's going to be best in this case because the pesticides are going to be found more in your peels of your citrus fruits. So if you're just eating the fruit on the inside, it's not so bad. But when you're talking about using the peels and wanting to make the most of it, it is worth the extra cost to go ahead and get the organic. And I'm loving Misfits Market for our citrus. That's where I've been getting all our citrus lately, because citrus locally is very hard to get organically. So anyway, and you can see I filled the jar. This is a half-gallon jar, about halfway full of the dried peels, but it's very loosely in there because some of those are kind of long strips. So if you're using fresh peels, they're probably going to pack together. I would say don't go over a halfway full because you're going to want to have plenty of space for your water when you put that in there. And then the other thing you're going to need is some kind of sugar. So normally when I'm making vinegar, I use an organic cane sugar. But in this case today, especially since I'm making this as a health drink, I'm going to use some Glory Bee raw honey. Any good raw honey is going to be good as long as it's raw. That way you're going to be adding even more benefits to it if you go that route. But either way is going to be pretty healthy. And if you're concerned about the sugars, what I'm doing here, the fermenting process is going to eat up a lot of those sugars, and how long you let it ferment, or if you decide to let it fully go to vinegar, which will take out all the sugars, is going to be entirely up to you. Normally when I'm making a vinegar, I do not use a fermentation starter, but in this case I decided to go ahead and do this since I have a fermentation starter always ready to go anyway. And I happen to have an organic orange peel fermentation starter. That's what I'm going to use in this. When I'm doing a quart jar, I do a 1/4 cup of the liquid off my fermentation starters. When I'm doing a half gallon, I do a 1/2 cup. And if I'm doing a whole gallon, like when I'm making wine, I use a whole cup. So it's a quarter cup for every quart that you're gonna make. And these are very easy to make. You can make them out of herbs, fruits, even vegetables. Ginger is a very popular one, often called a ginger bug. And I have a pretty in-depth video on how to make them, how to refresh them, how to keep them alive. Like this one I started over a year ago. I'm just gonna go ahead and use this glass and fill it about half full. That's going to give me about a half cup because that's an 8-ounce glass, and I want 4 ounces of the fermentation starter. Again, you could very likely do this without adding the fermentation starter, just like you would with vinegar. But you can add it to vinegar if you want to. It helps give it a boost. And just to keep it alive and keep it always ready to go, I add a little bit of sugar, about a teaspoon or so, back into the starter, and then I top it off. I'm using filtered rainwater. You can use whatever water you have handy. I just recommend whenever you're fermenting, try to get something that is non-chlorinated. That means if you're relying on city tap water, which is always chlorinated, just dechlorinate it. It's easy to do, and I have a video on how to do that where I talk about several different methods. The two I recommend the most is either boiling, which obviously you want it at room temperature before you use it, back down to room temperature, or like I used to do before we started doing the rainwater, is just putting a cloth over an open receptacle and let it sit for a few days so that chlorine will evaporate out, because it will evaporate out on its own. But boiling it will also remove the chloramine. So anyway, I got the fermentation starter in there. Today I'm going to do something that I thought of in another video where I was doing something with honey, and I don't know why I didn't think of this before. Is I'm going to use my blender. So I'm going to, just to make it easier to mix, and I like to keep my honey raw, so I'm going to pour a little bit of water in there to start with. So I got a couple cups of water in there, just enough so I can blend this well. And then I'm going to use about a half cup. Boy, this honey's been in there for a while. It's already starting to crystallize. It's good honey though. So I want about a half cup of honey. You can use more if you want. I do recommend, at least for a half gallon when you're doing the citrus peels, I do recommend going with a half cup in this case. So I'm not even measuring it, as you can see. I'm just basically going by looks and knowing how much is in this jar. And by the way, I do leave my starter out for the rest of the day, let it get up to room temperature to start working through that sugar and get really active before I store it back in the refrigerator. All right, so what I'm going to do is just go ahead and process this up so it will blend that honey, which is really thick, in with the water a little better. So I'll finish this out once I got this processed. Okay, it's all done. Look at that. Looks really good. So hopefully it's all mixed in there really well. I think it is. It's funny, it looks like milk. And then I'm just going to go ahead and top this off with water, obviously, with the rainwater I've got here. Again, whatever healthy water you have. Now this is going to be a little foamy, so I might come back once it settles down and add a little bit more water to that. But for now, I'm going to put a lid on. Whenever you're using plastic lids, make sure that you have a silicone ring in there, because you're going to want to keep it kind of tight. So at least for the way that I'm doing this, I like to use my little hand crocheted dealies here whenever I've got stuff on my counter, especially if I've got to slide it back and forth. It'll help prevent a little more wear and tear on the counter and catch any liquids that might overflow, and so they don't run all over the counter. And so I just push it back here. And what I want to do is let this ferment for at least a week. Now, how long you let it ferment is going to be up to you. I want it to get a good week so it can really start working through those sugars. You might want to give it 2 weeks, depending on how much sugar you want to work through. But I also don't want it to turn completely to alcohol either. So I don't mind if it's got a real light, or just a real little bit of alcohol, where I don't notice it if I drink a couple of ounces a day. I don't feel anything. But if it gets any stronger than that, then I would rather just go ahead and let it turn to vinegar. But I don't want this to be vinegar. I want to be able to enjoy it. I'm not one that enjoys drinking vinegar. So it's totally up to you. If you want it to turn to vinegar, then all you have to do is, instead of putting a tight fitting lid on it, put a piece of cloth, as you can see in this picture here, with a rubber band, or even just use the regular band that you would have on a mason jar to hold the cloth in place. The purpose of the cloth is to keep bugs and dust and any of that kind of stuff out of the ferment, but gives it that airflow that it needs. Once the bacteria and yeast in there start converting the sugars into alcohol, then the oxygen will help turn the alcohol into vinegar. So that's how that works. But since I don't want this to be vinegar, I'm keeping the lid on there. So the same applies when you're making wine. You use an airlock with water in it. Some people have been messaging me wondering why it's not bubbling, why there's no bubbles going through their airlock. It's because they're not putting water in the airlock. Remember that it's an airlock to prevent oxygen from getting in, thus turning the wine or meat into vinegar. But you want the gases to be able to escape. So in this case, since I'm not using an airlock or any kind of ferment top, you just every so often, usually once a day, just come and burp it every so often. You don't have to take the lid all the way off unless you want to stick a long spoon or chopstick down in there to stir it every so often, which I do from time to time. But if the lid is tight enough, all you got to do is just shake it like that. If you got that silicone ring in there, it's going to prevent the liquid from leaking out. So I always have a certain order whenever I'm fermenting, whether it be wines, meads, no matter what it is. I always put my newest ferment here, so the oldest one is here and easier to get to. And this one's going to be ready pretty soon. Let me hold it up again now that the peels are up at the top so you can see better the color I've got going on in there. So that tells me it's pretty well infused, but I'm going to let it finish out the next few days because I want to make sure I get at least a good week, because I only started it I think a few days ago. And then you can just taste it. Taste it at the 1 week mark. See what you think about the flavor. If you want it less sweet, not so much sugar in there, especially if you're worried about the sugar content, then go ahead and let it ferment longer to work through there. But again, if you're concerned about the alcohol content, take that lid off and give it the air exposure it needs for it to turn completely to vinegar. And then for me, what I've been doing is taking about 2 ounces every day. Sometimes I'll take up to 4. So maybe I'll have a couple ounces in the morning and then have another couple ounces later in the afternoon. And again, I am just thrilled with how good it's been making me feel, generally speaking. So I know I'm getting another good source of vitamin C. I'm making the most out of those peels, plus getting the nutrients that are in those peels. A lot of times in your peels of fruits and vegetables, you've got nutrients that aren't found in the flesh and the meat part of the fruit or vegetable. So trying to make the most of all of our produce is going to be the best all the way around. It's like potatoes. I remember even as a kid learning that most of the minerals were found in the skins of the potatoes. Now I do realize this isn't for everyone. Not everyone can have citrus, and not everyone, especially if they're on medications, can have grapefruit or can take it at the same time. It's important to at least take them at separate times of the day. So if you've got grapefruit in there, just be careful if you're on medications. And if you do give this a try, after you've taken it for a little while, please come back and share your testimony on how you feel about it. Or if you've already been doing something similar or taken the decoction. Now the decoction is when you put all the peels in with water and you cook it down. When I've done it, I did it for a day. I think I did it a couple of different times. But I'm finding I like this much better. I like the decoction just fine. I didn't use any sugar or honey in that one, and it was just fine. I like the way it made me feel, generally speaking, but I'm finding I like this better. It's tastier and it makes me feel better, and I love that fizziness that I get. It's kind of like having a somewhat sweet and somewhat bitter soda, and it's all natural and it's very healthy and full of all kinds of great nutrients. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.